The Great Smoky Mountains feel alive, like something breathing just beneath the skin of the earth, whispering under a fog that never really lifts. Millions of hikers have walked these trails, snapped their photos, checked the views off their lists, convinced they've seen everything this park has to offer. They're wrong. There are paths here that end without reason, fences that appear overnight where no one remembers building them, caves sealed with concrete as if the rock itself was dangerous, and entire towns erased from every map, yet still standing in the woods with their windows staring out like eyes that never close. Officials call it safety, preservation, routine closures. But the rangers who've stayed long enough, who've heard things when the radios go silent and the air goes still, they know better. Because in these mountains, some places remember you, and some things don't echo back when you call out. They answer, so lock your doors, put your headphones on. After this, you'll never see the Smoky Mountains the same way again. They used to call it the Wonderland of the Smokies. Long before the fences, before the warning signs and the boarded windows, Elkmont was the crown jewel of Tennessee's hidden wilderness, a private escape carved into the trees along the Little River. In the early 1900s, Knoxville's elite came here to disappear from the world. They built cabins with wide porches that leaned over the water, strung lanterns through the branches, and danced under starlight that the city could never imitate. At night, music floated between the pines, and the glow from the Wonderland Hotel spilled like warm honey into the Appalachian dark. Then, in 1934, the story changed. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was created, and with it came contracts, surveys, and signatures. The government bought the land and offered the residents a strange compromise: lifetime leases. You could stay, they said, but only until your time ran out. Those agreements quietly expired in the early 1992, not with a bang, but with ink drying on paper in offices far from the woods. When the last signatures faded, the park moved in. Cabins were boarded up, roads were blocked and left to crack. Directional signs, once pointing the way to riverfront cottages and social halls, were removed as if they'd never existed. The forest did what forests always do. It began to take everything back. Ivy crawled up porch posts. Moss smeared over stone steps. Rafters sagged under the weight of a silence that didn't feel quite natural. At first, it all looked like standard preservation. Some structures were carefully restored for history's sake, their stories rewritten as exhibits. Others were dismantled in the name of safety, their pieces stacked and hauled away. But deeper in the woods, past a small bridge now swallowed by moss and leaning at a tired angle over the creek, there was one section that no one quite talked about. No placards, no brochures, no marked trail. Just a high, simple fence and a padlocked gate. Locals started calling it the quiet side. According to early maintenance records, that off-limits patch of forest once held at least 6 standing houses. Not ruins, not foundations, homes. They were never reclaimed, never razed, never featured on the walking tours. They were simply sealed. A few workers claimed they'd been told to avoid the area after audible disturbances were reported by survey crews in 1992, an official phrase that doesn't explain why seasoned rangers refused to patrol there alone. One ranger, who eventually transferred out of the park, tried to put it into words. He was making a routine sweep near the restricted zone when he heard it. A photograph of another time, playing in the present. A thin, scratchy waltz drifting through the trees, the kind of music you'd expect to hear pouring from a wind-up gramophone at a lantern-lit party decades ago. The sound was coming from inside one of the locked cabins. When he approached, the music stopped. He forced the door and stepped inside. Dust lay on every surface in a thick, undisturbed layer. No footprints, no fresh marks. In the corner sat an old record player, its needle snapped, useless since who knows when. It hadn't played music in decades. At least, not by itself. Over the years, curious hikers have found faint remnants of paths branching off from the main trail, narrow routes pulling them toward the restricted area. On park maps, these are labeled vaguely as non-maintained access roads, nothing more than relics of the past, yet people who follow them report the same sequence of sensations: a sudden drop in temperature that raises goosebumps even in summer, the smell of wet, rotting wood, thick and close, and that feeling like someone just stepped behind you and is waiting for you to turn around. Some say the air there doesn't move, it waits. By 2016, After a wave of online explorers hopped the fences, posted photos of decaying homes, and traded coordinates like urban legends, the National Park Service quietly reinforced the barriers. New locks, higher fencing, more distance between you and whatever was inside. The official explanation was predictable: public safety and environmental restoration. But buried in dry, redacted documents obtained through public record requests was a strange expense line: acoustic monitoring equipment, deployed and removed in the span of a few months. Whatever they were listening for, they heard it. Since that year, no new permits have been granted anywhere near the old Elkmont suburb. Not for research, not for restoration, not even for cleanup. The paperwork simply stops. And on certain nights, when the fog hangs low and the river sounds too far away, hikers still swear they can hear it, the faint echo of a waltz drifting through the pines, always fading when you step toward it, always just one step ahead. If Elkmont is where the past keeps playing for an audience that's long gone, then White Oak Sink is where the earth itself seems to hum under its breath. From above, it doesn't look like anything dangerous. Just a shallow depression tucked into the forest, a bowl of soft ground edged by limestone cliffs and surrounded, in spring, by wildflowers that spill color across the shadows. Hikers used to love this place. They would pass through on their way to the Schoolhouse Gap Trail, pausing to sit on fallen logs and enjoy the strange, steady coolness that seemed to seep up from the soil instead of down from the air. It felt like the mountain was exhaling through a hidden mouth. The first sign that something was wrong came in the winter of 2009. Rangers hiking near the cave entrance found the snow stained with small, twisted shapes. Hundreds of dead bats lay scattered around the opening, like leaves dropped in a circle. The official diagnosis came quickly: white nose syndrome, a brutal fungus that had been devastating bat populations across the eastern United States. To protect what little life remained, the park closed off the area, draping it in the usual language of conservation and biosecurity. It should have ended there. A disease, a closure, a line on a map. But White Oak Sink didn't stay quiet. Between 2013 and 2015, despite signs, warnings, and barricades, 3 separate incidents occurred within the cave system. The first was a lone spelunker who slipped past the restrictions and descended into the tunnels, anchored by a rope line. He never came back. When a recovery team finally located his gear, they found something they couldn't explain. His rope had not snapped, frayed, or been cut with a blade. It looked like it had melted fibers, fused and slumped, as if exposed to intense heat from nowhere. The second incident involved 2 biology students who entered under the pretense of research, skirting regulations to collect samples. They didn't get far. Just inside, they heard what they later described as a mechanical humming coming from deeper in the cave. Not wind, not water. Something steady, patterned, almost like distant machinery cycling through phases. They retreated before they could see the source. The third incident finally forced the park to act. A team of rangers went in to investigate both the missing spelunker and the strange reports. Deep inside the cave system, rock shifted. A collapse blocked their exit and trapped them in the dark for nearly 6 hours. When they were finally dug out, shaken and exhausted, someone thought to review their audio recordings. Beneath the scraping of rock, the crackle of radios, and the muffled cursing, there was something else. A low, pulsing hum that rose and fell in steady patterns, too regular to be random. It didn't sound like air. It sounded like breathing. The decision came fast. The entrances were filled with concrete, the openings sealed like wounds stitched shut. White Oak Sink was officially closed to the public, but the sound did not respect human decisions. In the years that followed, hikers walking near the restricted zone reported little failures of reality. Phones that slipped out of service even when they'd worked minutes before. Compasses that spun, then froze, then spun again. Some visitors described feeling rhythmic vibrations under their boots, like a distant engine starting up just before storms rolled over the ridge. One hiker said it felt like the earth was trying to speak through its own stones and had chosen that hollow to do it. Public records later revealed that the park installed acoustic sensors in the depression between 2016 and 2018, the kind used in geological monitoring to track tremors and subsurface movement. Strangely, the sensors were pulled out just 6 weeks after installation, and all data from the project was marked as non-public environmental record, No charts, no reports, just silence. A retired ranger, interviewed under the protection of anonymity, added one more detail. On his last patrol near the site, his radio picked up interference. Not the usual static, this was layered, overlapping, like multiple voices talking backward at once. At first, he assumed it was signal bounce, the kind of distorted reflection you sometimes get in deep valleys. Then one of the voices cut through clearly. It spoke his name. Today, the fences around White Oak Sink are higher. The signs warn of structural instability and fragile habitat. No official map shows the true depth of the caves beneath, but local residents still talk about certain nights when the hum returns, not loud enough to hear with your ears alone, but heavy enough to feel in your ribs, like the mountain is still breathing just below the surface, waiting for someone to answer. When the ground hums in the Smokies, people say the echoes don't just fade into silence, they travel. They move beneath the soil, slipping along old veins of rock, following the cold flow of underground streams until they meet the rivers that feed Fontana Lake. That's where Hazel Creek sleeps now, under black water and forgotten promises. On the maps, it's just a name attached to a shoreline, but beneath the surface, there's still a town. In the early 1900s, Hazel Creek was alive in the way frontier communities are. Alive, rough, loud, and hopeful. It was a logging town tucked into the valley, surrounded by dense forest and the constant ring of axes and saws. There were houses with smoke curling from their chimneys, a school where children traced letters on dusty slates, a post office that brought news from the outside world, and a small church whose bell tower stood above it all, a thin, bright sound cutting through the morning mist. That sound didn't last. When the Tennessee Valley Authority began construction on Fontana Dam in the early 1940s, everything below a certain elevation was doomed. Progress required sacrifice, and the people of Hazel Creek were told they had to leave. Families who'd lived there for generations packed up their lives into wooden crates and canvas bags. Coffins were dug up, or so they were told, and relocated to new graveyards on higher ground. The stories say at least most of them made the move. The rest stayed where they were, under the trees, waiting for the water to rise. In 1944, the dam closed. The valley flooded. Hazel Creek vanished beneath the newly formed lake. For decades, the only way to reach what remained was by boat. Fishermen would idle above where the main street used to run, watching their sonar screens flicker with unnatural shapes, straight lines, right angles, clusters that didn't belong to any natural rock formation, old walls, rooflines, a steeple that rose and fell in the grain of the scan like a heartbeat. On foggy mornings, locals swore they could still hear the church bell, muffled, faint, as though someone were ringing it from deep under the water. In 1972, a team of divers from Western Carolina University received permission to explore the submerged town. It should have become a famous study, a detailed record of a place preserved beneath the lake. Instead, their official report was strangely short. It mentioned unusual preservation of wooden structures, as if the water had been kinder to the town than time ever was, and ended with a recommendation against further dives due to psychological strain on participants. One of the divers never returned to the program. Off the record, he told colleagues that while he drifted through the drowned schoolhouse, he heard something moving inside. Not fish, not shifting debris, something walking in the rooms where desks still sat in rows as if class had never been dismissed. Time moved on. Hazel Creek stayed drowned, but the lake around it began to act strangely. Rangers and boaters noticed that currents seemed to pull towards certain inlets near the old town site, tugging in ways that didn't match the known flow patterns. In some places, the sound of the water slapping against the boat took on a hollow quality, like it was echoing off empty space rather than solid rock. Then, in 2010, a severe drought dropped Fontana's water levels to historic lows. For the first time in 60 years, parts of Hazel Creek emerged from the mire. Visitors who reached the exposed shoreline saw the tops of brick chimneys jutting up from the mud like crooked fingers. The tip of the church's bell tower clawed its way into the air. One witness, a local historian named Ralph Gibson, described the metal of the bell tower as strangely polished, untouched by rust, as if it had been scrubbed clean by something other than time and water. He came back a few days later with a small team and cameras, hoping to document everything before the lake rose again. But when they arrived, The tower was gone. The water level had not changed. No storm had churned the lake. The chimneys remained, half buried. Only the tower had vanished, as though it had never been there at all. The next morning, park officials restricted access to the area, citing unstable terrain and the risk of collapse. Yet satellite images from that same week showed a small fleet of boats and unmarked equipment clustered above Hazel Creek's heart. Whatever they were doing out there, it was never explained. It was never repeated. Today, no one is allowed within several hundred yards of where the town once stood. Even so, campers along the shore talk about nights when the water is perfectly still and the air refuses to move. On those nights, if you listen long enough, you might hear it. A bell ringing from somewhere far below, each chime growing fainter the closer you try to follow it, as if the sound itself is retreating deeper into the stone. And if sound can travel through water, you have to wonder what else might it be waking up inside the mountain. If Hazel Creek is where sound sinks and refuses to die, then Gregory Ridge is where that sound hardens into stone and refuses to let go. Not far from where the drowned town lies beneath Fontana Lake, another part of the Smokies hides something that was never meant to be found. A place where the mountain seems to remember being open and has done everything in its power to close itself again. In the spring of 1972, a geology student named Robert Greer was hiking near the Gregory Ridge Trail when he noticed something odd in the limestone. It wasn't a cave opening or a crack like you'd expect to see after a harsh winter. It was a fissure narrow, vertical, and almost too clean. The rock looked as if it had been split like glass under a blade, a smooth line running down the ridge where no natural fault should be. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in mountains like these, but Greer followed it anyway. He squeezed through the gap and stepped into the dark. What he expected was a shallow pocket of rock, maybe a small chamber at most. What he found was an entire system. Early reports describe corridors that wound deep into the ridge in ways that felt wrong to someone who knew stone. The walls weren't jagged or layered like typical caves. They were smooth in places, oddly curved, as if something had pressed against the rock from the inside and softened it. Some surfaces looked melted rather than eroded. Others bore circular patterns of heat discoloration, rings and swirls that didn't match water flow, air currents, or any known geological behavior. Greer and his small team managed to map less than 400 meters before things started to go wrong. Their lamps began to flicker, not all at once, but in a slow cascade. One bulb dimmed, then another, until the light seemed to throb in time with a sound they hadn't noticed at first, a low vibration in the air, steady and distant, like the hum of machinery running behind thick walls. There was no electricity for miles around. They left their equipment, marked their route, and sealed the entrance with temporary wooden supports, planning to return with better gear and more people. 2 weeks later, a storm rolled through the Smokies. When they came back, the fissure was gone. The entrance had collapsed on itself, burying the supports under tons of shifted rock. By the end of 1973, the National Park Service had quietly fenced off the area. The official reason, buried in dry memos, was geological instability. But in the handwritten margin of one field note, archived at the University of Tennessee, someone had added a phrase that didn't read like standard bureaucratic language: thermal residue consistent with unnatural origin. Over the next decade, a few determined crews tried to reopen the site. Each attempt ended the same way. Drills overheated and seized after only a short time in contact with the rock. Samples taken from the ridge vitrified, turned glassy under the drill bit, as if reacting to the touch. A local foreman, tired of the technical explanations, described it more plainly. The stone sweated heat. However, when they returned a few days later, the rock that had softened enough to sample had hardened again, fused into a single, unbroken wall where old cracks had been. It looked less like a collapse and more like a wound that had healed too fast. People in nearby communities started calling it the sealed vein, a scar line in the mountain no one could reopen. The theories came next. Some said lightning had become trapped underground, baking the stone from the inside. Others whispered about wartime experiments, about the government using remote ridges as testing grounds during the atomic age and then burying whatever went wrong. But no record from Oak Ridge, the nearest major research facility, ever mentioned activity in Cades Cove or Gregory Ridge, at least not in anything the public is allowed to see. In 1994, A small tremor rattled the region. It was barely enough to register on regional instruments, just a shrug from the earth. But campers at Abrams Creek woke up in the middle of the night to a sound they couldn't explain, a deep, low rumble rising from underground, followed by a single hollow crack that seemed to come from everywhere at once. When rangers inspected Gregory Ridge the next morning, they found the metal fence surrounding the old cave site bent inward, not pushed from the outside, but tugged toward the sealed stone, as if the mountain had inhaled. Since then, Gregory Ridge has remained closed. Even drones are prohibited within a 1-mile radius. The few who ignored that rule and posted their footage online didn't get much for their trouble. The videos show nothing unusual in the landscape, just trees and rock until the audio distorts. Sound warps. Static creeps in. Then everything goes quiet. Not naturally quiet, but cut-off quiet, like someone hit a switch. Official reports mention thermal anomalies and electromagnetic interference. One ranger who joined the last inspection put it another way. The rock was hot to the touch, and if you stood still long enough, you could feel it slow, deep, measured, as though the mountain was breathing behind the wall, and when mountains start to exhale, fire is never far behind. By the time fire finally showed itself, it felt less like a disaster and more like an answer. If Gregory Ridge was a sealed vein of heat holding its breath, then Chimney Tops was where that breath came out hot, wild, and completely wrong. November in the Great Smoky Mountains is supposed to be a season of fog and rain, of damp leaves and low clouds that cling to the ridges. But in 2016, the forest crackled. The air felt thin and electric, so dry that every step through the underbrush sounded like breaking bones. Residents described it the same way. Vibrant, restless, as if the mountains were waiting for a spark they already knew was coming. The official story of the Chimney Tops fire is simple on paper. 2 teenagers were seen throwing matches from an overlook along the trail. A stupid act, a small flame. Investigators traced the origin point, logged their findings, and pinned the cause to human negligence. Case closed. Except the fire didn't behave like it was supposed to. When experts reviewed the burn patterns, they noticed something unsettling. The ignition points didn't line up with wind direction. Flames had appeared in scattered patches that made no sense, lighting up places the wind should have shielded, skipping over others that should have gone up first. It was as if the fire had ignored the air and followed a different map entirely, one drawn underground. Witnesses on the mountain that night reported seeing something even stranger before the blaze took over. Pale blue orbs of light hanging in the dark above the treetops. At first, people thought they were ball lightning or reflections from distant equipment. But the lights didn't rise or drift away like sparks. They moved slowly downward, hovering just above the ridges, and then sinking into the ground as if slipping through invisible doors. Hours later, the fire leapt. By dawn, the blaze had spread far beyond what any model predicted, racing in every direction at once. Gatlinburg, cradled in the valley below, was swallowed in one of the worst natural disasters in Tennessee's recorded history. 14 people lost their lives. More than 2,000 homes and buildings were reduced to ash. Over 7,000 hectares of forest burned so fast that some trees never had time to fall. They simply blackened in place. Meteorologists struggled to explain what happened. Winds over the fire reached gusts of more than 130 kilometers per hour, hurricane-force speeds, despite the absence of any regional storm front. The firestorm created its own weather, twisting columns of flame that spun across ridges and jumped gaps no normal wildfire could cross. It was like watching the sky learn a new way to burn. When firefighters and rangers finally pushed into the heart of the devastation near Chimney Tops, they found something that didn't make it into most news broadcasts. Beneath the charred rocks and collapsed soil was a fissure, narrow but deep, slicing into the mountain. Its edges weren't jagged or crumbly like freshly broken stone. They were smooth and blackened, glazed with a sheen that looked disturbingly familiar to anyone who'd ever seen. Gregory Ridge samples like rock that had been burned from the inside and then cooled too fast. Weeks after the last flames died, the heat didn't. Thermal imaging scans revealed pockets of residual warmth under the ground, glowing like embers in a fireplace long after the logs turned to ash. The temperature rose and fell in slow cycles. Rangers who walked the area said it felt like standing over a sleeping animal whose breath you could feel through your boots. A confidential report surfaced briefly online, labeled Anomalous Thermal Activity, Site 17B, before it was scrubbed from most places it appeared. It described localized energy retention and combustion signatures inconsistent with organic material, and showed a pattern of burned ground that followed geological fault lines rather than the terrain above. One note in the margins summed it up in a single sentence. The pattern is not random. The ground burns as if following instructions. Today, that part of the Chimney Tops trail has never been fully reopened. What used to be a popular, crowded overlook is now a narrowed, heavily monitored access point. Visitors who make it that far stand in front of charred trunks and skeletal branches, a blackened forest that still carries a faint, dry smell of smoke even on cold, wet days. Some nights, when the fog crawls low and the wind refuses to blow, hikers swear they can see small, ghostly lights near the ridge, pale blue, hovering quietly, the same color witnesses saw before the fire began. They don't drift up. They seem to be looking for a place to go back in. If Chimney Tops was the moment the mountains exhaled fire, then the Noland Tunnel is where that breath kept going, slipping out of sight, still moving somewhere beneath the surface. Because not everything buried in the Smokies is ancient. Some of it was carved by human hands, pointed straight into the dark, and then abandoned when something started answering back. When Fontana Dam was completed in 1944, it didn't just drown towns like Hazel Creek, it stranded them. Families were pushed out, valleys filled with water, and the government made a promise. There would be a new road, a way to reconnect the lost communities on the far side of the lake. Construction began. Blueprints were drawn. Asphalt bit into untouched forest. They called it Lakeview Drive, a name that sounded hopeful, almost scenic. The locals gave it another name, the Road to Nowhere. For 6 miles, the pavement runs through quiet woods, hugging slopes and ridges, seemingly on its way to some overlook or gateway that never appears. Instead, it ends abruptly at a concrete mouth carved into the mountain, the Noland Tunnel. Beyond that, there's nothing finished. Just rock, mud, and the ghost of a project that never came true. The official reasons for abandoning it are familiar budget cuts, unstable geology, environmental concerns. Sensible explanations, the kind that fit on a report and stay there. But according to internal memos from as early as 1943, long before the final decision, project engineers were already nervous. They logged unclassified disturbances during excavation, echoes that didn't match the tunnel's shape, rhythmic vibrations that seemed to come from deeper in the ridge, pulsing through the granite like a heartbeat. Work stopped after a collapse that killed at least one worker. The survivors said the same disturbing thing. The rock didn't fall from the ceiling. It buckled from inside, as if something behind the tunnel pushed outward. Decades passed. The road remained half-born, the tunnel an open wound in the forest. Teenagers dared each other to walk through it at night, their footsteps slapping against wet concrete. Photographers loved the dripping walls, the graffiti that bloomed across the stone in warnings and symbols. Every few years, someone would go in and not come out. Search parties found their cars, their backpacks, sometimes their flashlights lying on the ground with the bulbs melted inward, glass warped as though it had been held over a flame that left nothing else behind. In 2011, a group of urban explorers decided to solve the mystery with technology. They sent a drone into the main tunnel, hoping to map whatever lay beyond the visible curve. For 2 minutes, the transmission was normal grainy rock, slick floors, the slow drift of concrete supports. Then the feed glitched. Static, distortion, a stutter of black frames, and then nothing. 72 hours later, the drone's GPS tracker flickered back to life. It wasn't in the tunnel anymore. It pinged from a restricted area of the park, 5 kilometers from the entrance, in a place with no direct path from where it had started. The footage was destroyed, corrupted beyond recovery except for 6 seconds of audio. Technicians described the sound as metal scraping against stone, like a train arriving on tracks that weren't there. A year later, another team tried again. This time, the drone came back on its own, returning to the tunnel entrance and landing without being called. Its internal SD card was corroded, useless. But park staff noted something else. The edges of the camera lens were slightly melted, warped by heat. There were no burn marks anywhere on the frame, no soot, no scorch, just an invisible line where the air must have changed. People in Bryson City and beyond have their theories. Some say the tunnel broke into an old network of mine shafts. Others insist the government used the system for wartime tests and sealed it when they couldn't control what was on the other side. The strangest claim came from a maintenance worker who retired in 1999. When asked if the tunnels were truly abandoned, he shook his head. "They're not abandoned," he said. "They're redirected. They don't lead through the mountain anymore, they lead beneath it." Today, steel gates block every known entrance to the Noland system. The air near the tunnel is colder than it should be, with a damp bite that smells faintly of ozone. The walls drip condensation like sweat. Visitors who stand there long enough talk about hearing whispers that don't quite line up with their own echoes, as if the response is coming from someone standing just behind them, just out of sight. And sometimes, when the mist rolls in from Lake Fontana and settles over the entrance like a curtain, you can hear it, a long, hollow rumble that sounds exactly like a train approaching in the dark. It grows louder, closer, fills the tunnel as though something is about to arrive, but nothing appears. The sound just passes by, as if the tracks it's following are somewhere far below your feet. 6 places, hidden beneath the breath of the Great Smoky Mountains. 6 reasons why maps don't tell the whole truth. Empty cabins in Elkmont, where the music still plays for no one. White Oak Sink, where the earth hums through its own bones. Hazel Creek, ringing bells for the drowned town that won't stay quiet. Gregory Ridge, sealed by a heat that never fully cooled. Chimney Tops, where the sky burned from within and the fire followed invisible lines. And the Noland Tunnel, echoing towards something that was never built, but never stopped moving. Maybe it's all connected, the sound, the heat, the silences between them. Maybe the mountains remember what we've tried to bury. Every fence, every closed area sign, every path scratched off a map might not exist to protect us from what's inside. It might be to protect whatever is inside from us. 6 stories, 6 warnings carved in fog and stone. If you've made it this far, thank you. Leave a like if any of these places stuck with you. Tell us in the comments which one haunted you the most and which trail, town, or tunnel you want us to explore next. Just remember, in the Great Smoky Mountains, some trails aren't lost, they're waiting.